If all you are doing is developing the good part of the city, then sort of by definition you're going to drive the poor people to the bad part of the city. You cannot stop urbanization. As I said yesterday, we are going through a period in human history that's about a half a century long, and we're about halfway through it. People have been, for 8,000 years, they have moved to the city for a better life. When they move, one of the things they do, they move because they walk to their work. They walk to their supplies, they walk to their school, they walk to everything. And so they're minimizing all of their costs, and they minimize their housing costs, and that means they live in tiny spaces. This has always been the case. East End of London, Lower East Side of Manhattan. Every time there is urbanization, there are slums. And slums are yucky. Slums also are places where criminals live, illegal activity of all kinds. It's kind of an alternate power structure. So it's natural for governments to want to clean up the slums. This neighborhood very clearly was not a slum. If you look at the structure of these buildings, I would guess that 50 and 60 years ago this was an upper middle class area. And it changed. Cities change in that way, okay? And when they become selected against, the deceleration, the descent can be very rapid. So this is a neighborhood where I, as a Bostonian, look at it and say, I would love to renovate this. If this were renovated, if these facades were brought back, it would be like Beacon Hill in Boston or the North End of Boston. 60 years ago, the North End of Boston looked a little better than this, but not much. Today, the North End of Boston is one of the most, chic areas in the world, in the city. Poor people, this is going to sound silly, poor people cannot afford the cost of market housing in the city. You therefore give them one of three choices. One, live far outside the city, in which case we have pollution, we have traffic jams, we have all kinds of problems. Two, live in unacceptable housing in the city. Or three, government, with incentives and regulation and actual conscious strategy, creates affordable housing that is of good quality. So if you had filmed me 60 years ago in a part of Boston called the West End of Boston, it would have looked not much different from this. And in 1950, something called the Boston Redevelopment Authority demolished the West End of Boston and put up high-rises that look much like the kind that I suspect Toki would like to put up here. 60 years later, people still talk about that as a mistake for the city because they demolished all of the fabric of the city, all of the social structure of the city, and they regret it. Bottom line, if you follow the real estate principles to their natural conclusion, you will drive poor people out of the city. As you drive them out of the city, they in turn will find other places to live. And so, while yes, you can make Tarlabaşı anything you want, and you can pick all these people up if you want, and relocate them anywhere you want, they will migrate back to somewhere else. And that's somewhere, and because they're seeking to be connected to the city, and they will find a way to do it by hook or by crook. So, I guess my bottom line is, if Toki were to do that, it would be self-defeating. A place like this is a community. Now, I may not see the community. The people may all go and hide when I come into the community. But it's a community. People know each other. There is an awareness of who's an insider and who's an outsider. Okay? That's part of the why illegal activity flourishes in a community like this, because it is part of the community and it's protected inside it. Throughout the last 60 years, US, UK, France, anywhere you talk about, you take a neighborhood like this, you pick all of the people up and you move them somewhere else. It's just as if you tore up the grass and tried to replant it. You destroy the connections among people that make community, and they rebuild them. There are many examples. This was a great mistake we made in the United States. We put people in public housing concrete high-rises where there was no community. And we ruined the high-rises, we ruined the places we put them in, we ruined the people. It was a mistake. So I would hope that Toki would not do that. Throughout history and in modern society, ownership of residential real estate is one of the most basic, the most accessible, the most reliable means that poor people gain wealth. It's also one of the ways in which they can put their labor to work, home improvement and things like that. If you live in housing that does not benefit you, if it is improved, you do not improve it. So I want to turn slums into financial assets for the people who live in them. Because if you turn it into that asset for the people who live in it, it will get better. Secondly, slums have to be seen as part of the ecosystem of the city. They have to be seen as an asset to the city. Slums are a place in which very poor people who do low-skill or unpleasant jobs can live in the city and do those jobs for the rest of the city. You will find if you go back 150 years that in London they had night soil men who cleaned up horse manure and human manure. They lived in slums. That's a job I wouldn't want to do, you wouldn't want to do. But London needed to have it done. There were some people who did it. Every economy has a bottom quartile or a bottom tenth. Those people have to live somewhere. Your choice is to have them live in informal, purely private communities, which we call slums, or to have, as I've indicated before, to have government become involved in creating genuinely integrated, genuinely affordable housing. And it is a challenge, because you have to do one or the other. The city does not exist that has no poor people. It's also, unfortunately, the case that if you decide that a neighborhood is condemned, you cut capital out of it. I'm sure these people here can no longer finance their houses. So once the government says this neighborhood is condemned, well, it will be condemned, because nobody can afford to fix up the property, which would be too bad, because as I look at this, this looks to me like a neighborhood of a particular point in time in the particular development of Istanbul. And as a Bostonian, if I could have the West End back, I would want it back. We preserved the North End. We didn't preserve the West End. Today, if you were to go to Boston, thousands of people go to the North End. No one goes to the West End except the people who live there. Maybe in the greater scheme of things, maybe this neighborhood would be better served. Maybe Istanbul would be better served if this neighborhood was made high-end. But if that were the case, I would want that the people who live here wind up living somewhere close to here in significantly better accommodations than they currently live in. That's the obligation that you owe the poor people who, by virtue of immigration to the city and incumbency in the city, if they don't have that judicial right, then they're not really citizens, and we're not treating them the same as we treat everybody else.
So, as a last question maybe, so what would you advise for Tarlabaşı to happen?
Who am I advising? Am I advising?
The municipality, the people who live here. Both parties.
I would advise that you keep it as a historic district and that it emerge as a mixed income district. I would envision 50 to 60% market housing, 25 to 30% low middle housing, and 20% very low income housing. It turns out you can do income mixing. You could have all of these facades beautiful. You could have 25% of them occupied by very poor people. I suspect the occupancy here is not very high. There's a lot of buildings that look to be empty. If you had mixed income housing, then you'd have a vibrant neighborhood, you'd have a substantial asset for the municipality of Istanbul, and it would be an asset for the people who live here. Again, I know U.S. experience very well. In public housing projects, residents fight like tigers to stay in their property when it is renovated. And the same people who seem to you to be no good, when they're the only people living here, become the anchor of the community when it is renovated as mixed income. And here comes our renovation now.